English in India. I have them fly to India for gold, ransack the ocean for oriental pure. These are the words of Dr. Faustus in Christopher Marlowe's play, Dr. Faustus. The play was written almost in the same year as in the East India Company launched upon its trading adventures in India. Marlowe's words here symbolize the Elizabethan spirit of adventure. Dr. Faustus sells his soul to the devil, converts his knowledge into power, and power into an earthly paradise. British East India Company had a similar ambition, the ambition of power. The English came to India primarily as traders. The East India Company, chartered on 31st December 1600, was a body of the most enterprising merchants of the city of London. Slowly, the trading organization grew into a ruling power. As a ruler, the company thought of its obligation to civilize the natives. They offered their language by way of education in exchange for the loyalty and commitment of their subjects. Orientalist and Anglicist. English language reached India in the early 1600 when the East India Company started trading and English missionaries first began their efforts. Some early officials of the company, like Sir William Jones, were interested in the rediscovery of India's past. Sir William Jones established the Royal Artistic Asiatic Society of Bengal in 1784, and Sir Thomas Munro too much was impressed by the Indian culture. These men came to be called the Brahmanized Britons or the Orientalists because they admired Oriental culture and deprecated the idea of introducing Western civilization into India. The Orientalists were in the favor of the use of classic languages of Indian tradition such as Sanskrit and Persian. The Anglicists, on the other hand, supported English. In their debate with the Orientalists, the missionaries and the Anglicists have perceived Indian language and people as degenerate. Uh, Orientalists supported the use of Indian language while the Anglicists favored English. The beginnings. By the beginning of the 19th century, Britain or East India Company was more or less the master of the situation in India. In 1813, the commercial monopoly of the company ended, and the British in India assumed, beside police functions, missions of educating as well as civilizing the population. Uh, a token grant of rupees 1 lakh per year was made for education, and the idea was to promote only Oriental education. Printing presses in different parts of the country and books in the vernacular as well as in English were coming out since the beginning of the 18th century. Along with grammars, dictionaries, and translations, the printing presses also gave the rise to the first ever newspaper, Hickey's Bengal Gazette. Others followed in due course. Last came the private schools that imparted the English education. Such schools have been started as early as 1717 as Kralore near Chennai, 1718 at Mumbai, and 1720 at Kolkata, culminating in the establishment of Hindu College in 1817. The Hindu College, started by Raja Rammohn Roy and his friends, later became the Presidency College in 1855. Western education was spreading fast in different parts of India and was doing much better than the institution imparting Oriental education. The Orientalist and the Anglicist continued to wrangle, but it was quite evident that former were steadily losing ground. Till finally, Macaulay's celebrated minute settled the issue. He declared that it was both necessary and possible to make the natives of his country good English scholars. On 17th March 1885, Lord Bentinck resolved the great object of the British government ought to be the promotion of European literature and science among the natives of India. Macaulay's Minutes. By the turn of the century, the imperialists believed in giving English education to Indians. There was a pressing need for Indian clerks, translators, and lower officials in the administration. The knowledge of English was essential for these jobs. With the close of the 18th century, missionaries came to India to India for spreading the word of Christ among the native Indians. A large number of missionary schools imparting English education were set up by the early 1800s. The Orientalists opposed the project of importing English education in India. Lord Macaulay, who is called the father of English education, asserted in the House of Commons a year before he sailed to India to trade with civilized men is infinitely more profitable than to govern savages. The civilized subject of the Macaulay's imagination was not the slave who performed his salams to the British, but the English educated gentleman using English tapestry and English cutlery, the man who valued English manufactures and spoke the English language. In 1835, as a law officer to the Supreme Council, he drafted a document which came to known as the Macaulay's Minute on Education. The process of producing English-knowing bilinguals in India began with the Minute of 1835, which officially endorsed T.B. Macaulay's goal of forming a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern, a class of persons, Indians in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. According to Kachru, the far-reaching Minute was highly controversial because of the disagreement about whether it was correct to impose an alien language on Indians or not. The Orientalists expressed their disagreement in a note dated 15 February 1835, but they couldn't stop it from passing and had to give way. On 7th March 18, the Minute received a seal of approval from the Lord William Bentinck on the official resolution. Macaulay's Minute was passed. This resolution formed the cornerstone of the implementation of the language policy in India, the Renaissance in modern India. During the 20 years between 1835 and 1855, the number of those educated in English had been rapidly increasing. It is said that even in 1835, 4 to 35, 32,000 English books were sold in India as against 18,000 in native Indian languages. India started with reading and speaking English, and they soon started writing also. Indian writing English was one of the manifestations of the new creative urge in India, which is often referred to as the literary renaissance in India. The study of English literature stimulated literary creation in Bengali, Marathi, Telugu, Gujarati, and Indian languages, and Indian English literature had the same origin as other modern literature in India, though here the foreign element seemed more pronounced. The Renaissance in modern Indian literature began with the Raja Rammohun Roy's understanding of the different regions of the world had been compared them with the Vedantic philosophy and grammar, garner the best from each religion. Sufi mysticism had great influence on Roy. Dissatisfied with the system of the education, the rote learning method of teaching English, he formed an association of English and Hindi schoolers. He also invested his own money in the starting of school, where he introduced subjects like science, mathematics, political science, and English. Roy felt that understanding of these modern subjects would give Indians a better understanding of the world of the day. Though initially antagonist towards British rule, Roy began to feel that the country would benefit in terms of education by exposure to the good points of the Western culture. Called a stooge of the British, Roy made his first and only trip to England in November 1830, where he lived until his life was tragically cut short on September 27, 1820. After a brief illness in England, he wrote a brief biography on request, was published in Athenaeum and the Literary Gazette. He just started the tradition of Indian leaders writing autobiographies. Modern autobiographers like Gandhi, Nehru, and Surendranath Banerjee and Raja Prasad Rai may proudly raise their lineage to him. Reformers like Raja Rammohun Roy were in favor of English education. Roy was followed in the early 19th century in Bengal by the poets Henry Doraggio and Michael Madhusudan Dutt. It was told that Indian English writing really graduated from imitation to authenticity. She was the first Indian poet to make an extensive use of Indian myth and legends in poetry. However, the most famous literary figure of this era was Rabindranath Tagore, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913. As a writer, Tagore primarily worked in Bengali, but after his success with Gitanjali, he translated many of his other works into English. He wrote over 1,000 poems, 8 volumes of short stories, almost 2 dozen plays, 8 novels, and many books and essays on philosophy, religion, education, and social topics. Thereof the Gandhian whirlwind. English became the official academic language of India by the early 20th century. The rising of the nationalist movement in 1900 brought some anti-English sentiment with it, even though the nationalist movement itself used English as its medium. Gandhi and Nehru showed how English language could be a tool of insubordination and ultimately freedom. The Gandhian whirlwind blew across the country during 1920 to 1947. The inevitable impact of the Gandhian movement on Indian English literature was the sudden following of the realistic novels during the 1930s. The emergence of Mulk Raj Anand, R.K. Narayan, and Raja Rao was the most remarkable event in the realm of Indian English fiction in their novels. Prevailing social and political problems that Indians found themselves in were given prominence. The nationwide movement of Gandhi not only inspired Indian English novels but also provided them with some of their prominent themes such as the struggle for freedom, the East-West encounter, the communal problem, and the miserable condition of the untouchable, the landless poor, the downtrodden, the economically exploited and oppressed. English in the Indian subcontinent. The British Empire is now gone, where what remains is the English language. Despite continued resentment from some section, English remains at the heart of the Indian society. It is widely used in the media, in higher education, the government, and therefore remains a common means of communication. According to a recent survey, approximately 4% of the Indian population using English. That figure might seem insignificant, but out of the total population that represents 35 million speakers, the largest English speaking community outside the USA and UK. The English language remains in India even after the other traces of British Raj have receded from view. In the past, it was often taken for granted that native speakers were the only approximate models for language learners. Today, non-native speakers outnumber native speakers of English. It has been claimed that English is no longer the property of native speakers but belongs to everyone who speaks it. After independence, particularly from the 1950s onwards, English began to acquire a distinct Indian voice through greater innovation and creativity. English is getting absorbed into Indian languages even as it enriches itself by assimilation them in turn. It has acquired a specific cultural identity in India and centered India's linguistic and literary creativity. Starting from Tarudas, Rabindranath Tagore, Mulk Raj Anand, R.K. Narayan, to Kamala Das, Salman Rushdie, Vikram Seth, Arundhati Roy, and the like, the parade of excellent Indian writers is long. Why these writers choose to write in English? R.K. Narayan choose to write in English because it is the only language I am really familiar with. It is the only language which is transparent and takes on the hues of the country and region where the story is set. Creative writing in English has gained its stature in recent years. International awards such as Booker Prize and national awards like Sahitya Akademi are the indicators of the increasing appreciation and acceptability of creative writing in Indian English. Indian fiction in English and introduction. Indian English novel today. Novel is a form of creative expression both in English and regional languages began to emerge in India as a result of the European invasion. It is true that English novels that began to be read by the English educated Indians functioned in a huge way as a models for the early novelist. But the fiction produced in India cannot be treated as a mere imitation of the Western novel. The socio-political condition that resulted in the development of the form called novel in Europe had its parallel in India under the British rule. Borghese values that got filtered from the Indian society created awareness about the concepts like equality, fraternity, democracy, and individualism. The novel carries in its body the post-Renaissance values that place the individual over the community. The single voice narratives that emerged in the later part of the 19th century in various Indian languages as well as Indian became expressions of a new era that questioned the traditional values and narrative forms. The first novel in India, Rajmohan's Wife, was serialized in the year 1864 and was later published in the year 1935. Bankim Chandra Chatterjee attempted to indigenize the form of the novel by a liberal use of Indian words and by attempting to tell a story that is truly Indian. The first novel in India, Rajmohan's Wife, was serialized in the year 1864 and was later published in the year 1935. Bankim Chandra Chatterjee attempted to indigenize the form of the novel by liberal use of the Indian words and by attempting to tell a story that is truly Indian. Krupabhai Satyanandan Saguna